May God bless your day and your entire week as we embark on this journey together. Welcome to another deep dive. Today we have an incredibly dense stack of sources in front of us, focusing on Exodus chapter 23.
We really do.
Yeah, and we are analyzing this text through the scholarly insights, the historical context, and, the theological notes provided by the Holman Study Bible and the NAA. That is the Nova Almeida Actualizada Study Bible.
It is a text that absolutely demands careful analysis. For those of you listening who are already deeply familiar with the broader Exodus narrative, chapter 23 often it gets overshadowed by the massive Sinai events, the dramatic stuff.
Right, the thunder and lightning.
Exactly. But when you look closely at the commentary from the Holman and NAA text, this chapter is really where the high-minded theology actually hits the dirt of everyday life. We are looking at the direct intersection of civil, religious, and ecological codes.
And that is exactly what makes it so compelling to me. We aren't talking about abstract spiritual concepts here. We are looking at a highly structural blueprint for a functioning society. I mean, the text covers everything from the mechanics of ancient justice and the complexities of mob mentality to radical empathy for your worst enemies.
Not to mention enforced economic rest.
Right, and a military conquest involving psychological warfare and hornets. Lots to cover. Our mission today is to figure out how these seemingly scattered ancient codes weave together to reveal a profound social framework.
And while these laws are thousands of years old, you have to realize the underlying human behaviors they addressed haven't changed at all. The texts deal directly with issues you probably navigate every single day.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, the dangers of going along with the crowd, the near impossibility of actually resting in our modern hustle culture, and that universal frustration we all feel when progress in our lives seems, well, agonizingly slow. The architecture of these ancient laws reveals a masterpiece of social and spiritual engineering.
Let's jump right into the first 9 verses, which heavily focus on the administration of justice. Verse 2 immediately caught my attention because of how incredibly modern it sounds. It warns, "Do not follow the crowd in doing wrong."
It has a powerful line.
It really is. It is often translated as not following the multitude to pervert justice. And honestly, it reads like a direct indictment of the kind of modern internet mob mentality we see every single day,
Oh, absolutely.
where truth is entirely subjective to just the sheer volume of the crowd yelling about it.
The NAA Study Bible specifically links these opening verses together under the overarching theme of justice and mercy. And it makes a critical point about how ancient Israel viewed the courtroom.
How so?
Well, justice wasn't just a cold, clinical legal obligation to keep society from collapsing. It was understood as a direct reflection of God's own character. Therefore, the notes emphasize that there is absolutely zero tolerance for partiality. The legal system had to be anchored in objective truth, immune to the pressures of a vocal majority.
That concept of partiality gets really nuanced in verse 3, though. It explicitly commands the Israelites not to show favoritism to a poor person in their lawsuit, which honestly feels a bit counterintuitive.
It does feel backwards at first glance.
Right, because you would assume the biblical mandate is always to favor the marginalized or the underdog in any dispute against the wealthy.
And that assumption is exactly why this law is so profound. The Holman Study Bible connects this specific verse to Leviticus 19.15 to really clarify the standard here. Favoritism of any kind destroys justice. Tilting the scales for the rich out of bribery or political influence is obviously corrupt. We all get that.
Sure, that is standard corruption.
But tilting the scales for the poor out of misplaced sentimentality or a desire to merely balance historical inequalities is equally forbidden in this specific legal context. True justice has to be completely blind to socioeconomic status. If you follow the crowd to twist the truth...
Even if the crowd has good intentions.
Exactly. Even if the crowd genuinely believes they are doing it for a noble, equitable cause, you are fundamentally perverting the system.
That idea of objective fairness bleeds right into how they were commanded to handle interpersonal conflicts. But the text moves from the public courtroom to a deeply private, awkward scenario. Verses 4 and 5 bring up the enemy's donkey.
Yes, the donkey law.
It says, if you see the donkey of someone who hates you wandering off, you have to return it. More intensely, if you see that donkey struggling under a heavy load, you are legally forbidden from just walking away. You have to stop and help your enemy free the animal.
What's fascinating here is how the NAA Study Bible analyzes the psychological weight of that command. This isn't about fostering a polite neighborly tolerance. The law requires active physical love. It moves completely beyond mere sentiment or internal forgiveness.
Wait, so the law isn't satisfied with just saying, I won't sue my enemy or I won't actively plot against them. It legally binds them to do manual labor together in the dirt.
Precisely. And the NAA insight here is brilliant regarding human nature. By forcing the Israelite to physically assist their enemy, the law is engineered to practically break the cycle of bitterness. Think about the mechanics of this. You cannot easily maintain a posture of pure, unadulterated hatred for someone while you are sweating next to them, shoulder to shoulder, trying to lift a heavy burden off a suffering animal. It serves as an active, physical disruption of animosity.
To put that in a modern context, it would be like seeing your absolute worst workplace rival. Like
Yeah,
the person actively trying to sabotage your career,
right.
and they are stranded on the side of the highway in the pouring rain with a flat tire. The law doesn't just say don't slash their other 3 tires. It says you have to pull over, get out in the rain, and physically help them change the tire. The psychological friction there is massive.
It forces a direct confrontation with shared humanity. And that exact same psychological mechanism extends to how the society was instructed to treat outsiders. By verse 9, the text circles back to protecting the vulnerable, specifically the foreigner or the alien living in the land.
And the reason it gives us so specific.
It is entirely rooted in repurposed trauma. The text says, do not oppress a foreigner. You yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners because you were foreigners in Egypt.
They are commanded to weaponize their own historical trauma for empathy, rather than using it as an excuse to build defensive walls. They knew the anxiety of being the outsider, so they had to become the protectors of the outsider.
That is the cornerstone of Israelite ethics. The memory of their suffering wasn't allowed to fester into xenophobia. It had to be the wellspring of their compassion.
That focus on alleviating the burden of the vulnerable transitions beautifully into the next section, verses 10 through 13. Okay, let's unpack this. Here, the text moves from relational peace to ecological and economic peace. It introduces the Sabbath year.
The 7-year reset.
Exactly. The Israelites are commanded to plant their fields, prune their vineyards, and gather their crops for 6 years. But in the 7th year, they have to let the land completely rest. No plowing, no planting, no organized harvesting at all.
You really have to pause and consider the sheer terror of that command for an ancient agrarian society.
I can't even imagine.
Right. In an era without refrigeration, global supply chains, or massive corporate agricultural reserves, your entire survival depended on your annual crop yield. To voluntarily halt all agricultural production for an entire year is unthinkable from a purely economic standpoint. It defies every human instinct for self-preservation.
Modern agricultural science tells us that crop rotation and letting fields lie fallow is essential for nitrogen fixing and soil health. But the text doesn't frame this as a farming hack. The primary reasons given are deeply social. It says you let the land rest so that the poor among the people may get food from it, and the wild animals may eat what the poor leave behind.
The Holman Study Bible provides some profound context on this intertwining of ecological and social welfare. This system ensures that the primary beneficiaries of the land's rest are the marginalized. The poor, the foreigners, and the servants are given unhindered access to whatever the land naturally produces that year.
That is incredible.
Furthermore, the text explicitly applies this same principle to the weekly Sabbath in verse 12. You don't just rest for your own mental health. You rest so that your ox, your donkey, the servant born in your household, and the foreigner may be refreshed.
So the rest isn't a luxury for the landowners. It is a mandated structural pause that trickles all the way down the socioeconomic ladder to the livestock.
If we connect this to the broader theological picture, the Holman notes highlight the massive trust factor this required. The commentators compare this enforced year-long economic pause to the way God provided manna for the Israelites in the wilderness.
The daily bread.
Exactly. For those who need a quick refresher, before they entered the land, they relied on a daily miraculous provision of food that they couldn't hoard. The Sabbath year was essentially a societal recreation of that wilderness experience. It was a structural safeguard against human greed, hoarding, and the relentless overexploitation of both the earth and human labor.
It is the ultimate antidote to hustle culture. It proves that human worth and societal value are not exclusively tied to constant, unbroken production. You are legally commanded to stop, and society must make space for the marginalized to glean from that pause.
It systematically dismantles the illusion of total self-reliance, forcing a communal dependency on divine providence rather than solely on human striving and economic output.
Following this period of deep rest, the text immediately bursts into mandated celebration. Verses 14 through 19 outline the agricultural calendar, focusing on three major annual festivals: the Festival of Unleavened Bread, the Festival of Harvest, which is also known as First Fruits, and the Festival of Ingathering at the end of the agricultural year.
The Holman Study Bible features a highly revealing word study here on the Hebrew word used for these gatherings, which is chag.
Chag.
Yes. While it is often simply translated as festival or feast, the root of chag originally carried the idea of a pilgrimage. It implies a physical journey, a deliberate stepping out of your normal daily routine and geography to gather collectively.
Wait, so they are essentially pausing their harvest operations to undertake a massive collective pilgrimage.
They are.
How did linking their agriculture so closely to these specific religious pilgrimages change their economic mindset?
It anchored their economic prosperity directly to theological humility. The festivals were timed perfectly with the critical moments of the agricultural cycle: the spring barley harvest, the early summer wheat harvest, and the final autumn ingathering of fruits, olives, and grapes.
So right when they are making their money, essentially.
Precisely. By mandating a pilgrimage at the very moment they were realizing their wealth, the ancient Israelites were structurally prevented from adopting a mindset of pure self-made arrogance. Every time they brought in a crop, they had to physically travel and throw a joyful feast to acknowledge the divine source of that blessing.
That is a brilliant way to keep a society grounded. But right at the end of this joyful, logical list of agricultural festivals, we hit verse 19, and it contains what has to be one of the strangest, most jarring rules in the entire chapter.
It is definitely a shift in tone.
It simply states, "Do not boil a young goat in its mother's milk." You are reading along about justice, fallow years, and harvest pilgrimages, and suddenly you are hit with a highly specific culinary restriction.
It undeniably stands out from the surrounding text. But the study Bibles provide vital clarity here, demonstrating that this isn't just a random dietary quirk dropped into the civil code. Both the NAA and Holman texts explore two main scholarly theories for this prohibition, and both carry significant theological weight.
I can imagine there is a historical context we are missing here. What was happening in the surrounding ancient Near East cultures regarding this practice?
The first and most prominent historical theory is that boiling a kid goat in its mother's milk was a direct reference to a Canaanite pagan fertility ritual. Archaeological and textual discoveries from surrounding nations suggest that this specific act was performed as a form of sympathetic magic.
Sympathetic magic.
Yes. The idea was to invoke the local fertility deities, attempting to magically manipulate them into blessing the flocks with rapid reproduction and the crops with abundant rain by essentially performing this ritual act.
That explains the historical boundary. By forbidding the practice, the Israelites are being told they don't need to adopt the superstitious, manipulative magic of their neighbors to guarantee their survival. But considering how much this chapter has already focused on ecological harmony and respect for nature, is there a deeper philosophy at play here?
There is, and it is a profoundly beautiful concept. The NAA notes suggest this law represents a fundamental respect for the natural order and the sanctity of life. Think about the biological purpose of a mother's milk.
It is meant for the baby.
Exactly. It is the ultimate substance of life, designed by God solely to nourish, protect, and grow the young.
So to take that exact substance, the milk biologically meant to give life, and use it as the boiling agent, the instrument of death and preparation for a meal, is a complete subversion of its purpose.
You nailed it. It takes a vehicle of life and twists it into a vehicle for death. Even in the necessary mundane tasks of preparing food or utilizing livestock, the law demands a profound reverence for God's created order. It teaches the Israelites that the how matters just as much as the what. You cannot violently subvert the symbols of life just because you have dominion over the animals.
That reframes the entire verse. It transitions from a bizarre ancient recipe to a sweeping theological statement on the sanctity of the natural world. Which brings us perfectly to the final section of chapter 23, verses 20 through 33. We shift from the internal laws governing their society to their external future, the conquest of the Promised Land.
The horizon shifts.
God promises to send an angel ahead of the Israelites to guard them on the way and to bring them into the place he has prepared.
This represents a crucial theological and geopolitical shift in the text. The Holman Study Bible provides essential historical context for understanding the role of this angel. In the ancient Near East, there was a deeply established political structure known as a suzerain-vassal treaty.
Right, we see that a lot in these ancient texts.
The suzerain was a sovereign, supreme king, an emperor of sorts, and a vassal was a lesser king, a servant, or a designated emissary who operated entirely under the suzerain's banner.
So if this angel is functioning as a vassal in this ancient treaty structure, the Israelites aren't just following a spiritual tour guide, they are following the absolute delegated authority of the suzerain king himself. The text says God puts his name in the angel, which means his full sovereign weight is behind this vanguard.
Precisely. To carry the king's name in the ancient world was to carry the king's absolute authority. And the methods this divine vanguard intends to use to drive out the Amorites, Hittites, Canaanites, and others are deeply fascinating. The text says God will use terror and hornets. Verse 28 says, I will send the hornet ahead of you to drive the Hivites, Canaanites, and Hittites out of your way.
Are the commentators suggesting God deployed literal swarms of giant stinging insects to clear the land? Because frankly, after the plagues of locusts and frogs in Egypt, weaponized entomology seems entirely within the historical playbook here.
The scholars certainly don't rule out literal insects. As you noted, physical plagues were a documented method of divine intervention in the Exodus narrative. However, the Holman notes feature a word study on the Hebrew word used here, which is garash.
Garash.
Yes, it means to cast out, to violently expel, or to drive away. It's a very aggressive, forceful term. Because of this, many scholars suggest the hornets are actually a powerful metaphor for psychological warfare.
A divine panic.
Yes. The terror mentioned in the preceding verse, combined with the hornets, represents an overwhelming, swarming dread that infiltrates the minds of the enemy armies. It causes a collapse of morale, making them break ranks and flee before the Israelite army even has to swing a sword. It is the psychological dismantling of the opposition.
That detail brings up a massive structural question for me regarding this text. If God is sending his personal sovereign angel, backed by divine terror and swarms of psychological or literal hornets, he clearly has the power to clear the entire land of Canaan in an afternoon.
He does.
Yet, verse 29 explicitly states, "But I will not drive them out from before you in a single year." Why hold back? If the land is promised, why not execute the ultimate immediate victory?
The answer the text provides is stunningly practical and rooted in deep ecological reality. The verse continues, saying, he won't do it in a single year because the land would become desolate and the wild animals would multiply against you.
That introduces a fascinating variable, the carrying capacity of the land itself. An empty city doesn't stay empty. Nature reclaims it.
Exactly. The NAA and Holman notes heavily emphasize this ecological balance. The Israelites at this point were still a relatively small population of wandering, formerly enslaved refugees. If God wiped out all the established inhabitants of Canaan at once, creating a massive demographic vacuum, the Israelites simply wouldn't have the sheer numbers to occupy all those cities.
They couldn't maintain the agricultural terraces and manage the infrastructure.
They couldn't. The wilderness would completely overrun the civilization.
Within months, probably.
Easily. If the land is emptied too quickly, the wild beasts native to the region, the lions, bears, wolves, they would rapidly multiply in the abandoned ruins. They would shift from being a managed nuisance to a lethal, overwhelming threat to the Israelites themselves. Therefore, verse 30 outlines the strategy. Little by little, I will drive them out before you until you have increased enough to take possession of the land.
Little by little, the victory had to be agonizingly gradual for their own physical protection. It is the deep wisdom of a slow victory.
When you apply that principle to the broader human experience, it fundamentally changes how we view delays. The Israelites had to grow into their blessing. They had to multiply, develop administrative capacity, and mature as a society before they could actually sustain the massive inheritance God was giving them. An immediate overnight victory would have been a catastrophic curse masquerading as a blessing.
They would have been devoured by the very land they were promised. That completely shifts the perspective on unanswered prayers or delayed progress. Instead of viewing the delay as God withholding a victory, this text frames the delay as God pacing the victory for your own survival. You literally don't have the capacity yet to manage the thing you are asking for.
It is a profound paradigm shift regarding how we understand divine timing and personal growth.
So as we pull all of these diverse threads together, what emerges from Exodus 23 isn't just a list of archaic rules for ancient peasants. It is an incredibly sophisticated web of social, ecological, and spiritual engineering.
Without a doubt. From ensuring the poorest of the poor have a structural right to glean from the fields, to demanding active, physically exhausting empathy toward a hated enemy, to enforcing rhythms of rest for human, beast, and soil alike. The entire architecture of the chapter is designed to create a community rooted in justice, empathy, and an absolute humble dependence on God.
It demands that we look at our enemies, our environment, our wealth, and our time through a completely different, highly intentional lens.
This raises an important reflection for all of us as we synthesize this text. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, specifically concerning that concept of the slow victory over the Canaanites. We live in a culture that worships instant success. We constantly pray for the immediate conquest of our problems, the overnight promotion, or the instant miraculous transformation of our circumstances. But considering the profound wisdom of Exodus 23, what slow victories in your own life might actually be God's way of protecting you from a success you aren't yet equipped to handle.
That is a brilliant and challenging question to sit with as we wrap up. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive as we part ways today. Know that God blesses all of you. Take care and keep exploring.